All right, everyone. So let's talk about a more complex grid, and that's one where the baseline um, corresponds to, or rather, the grid itself corresponds to the baseline grid, and the two work in harmony. I'll show you what I mean. So right now, I've got kind of I showed this grid so I can turn it on and off. But when we zoom in here and look, you'll see that, for instance, when I shut off the baseline grid and turn on the regular column and grid structure, that we end up with something that reconciles pretty precisely. And you can see this by where these intersecting lines are. And they all go through on the diagonal, they all line up on the bias and the columns and rows. And that's a function of my baseline, my margins, and every other measurable, definable area kind of syncing up. So I'll show you how we got there. So the first thing I'm going to do is open up a new document, Command N. We're going to set this up as I mentioned in the previous video. I'm going to set the number of pages to 3. Facing, I'm going to click OK. And then I'll come down here, and the very first thing I'm going to do is come up to View, Guides and Grids, and I'm going to unlock column guides. And this is going to make it so that you can adjust things without ending up with duplicates. It'll delete the original and only use the amended grid. So the next thing I'm going to do is come up and change my baseline grid by pressing Command K to pull up the Preferences palette. I'm going to change this to grass green. I'm going to change this to, we'll start this relative to the top margin, even though we haven't defined that yet. I'm going to put the increment, my baseline grid would be at 14, and as I mentioned in the previous video, I'm going to do a half leaded line, not a full leaded line from my baseline. So I'm going to put 7 point, change this to 50% so that I can see it when I zoom out, and I'm going to uncheck that so it floats over the top of everything, and I'm going to click OK. And then you can see there it is. The next thing I need to do is adjust my margins, and so I'm going to come up and I'm going to click Layout and then Margins, Guides. I'm going to change my top margin to 14 points, which is 1 pica, 2 points. You always use remainders, not decimals, when it comes to picas and points. There are 12 points to a pica and 6 picas to an inch. You're just going to have to trust me on that one. There is a bit of math involved in this, and I'll show you how I got there in a second. But basically, we're going to set this up as 14 points for the top. That's going to be 2 leaded lines, or at least 1 leaded line, and 2 of my baseline grid at 7 point. The bottom is going to be a little more, but we're going to leave it 0 for right now, and then I'm just going to set an inside margin at 7 points and an outside margin of 7 points. And then I'm going to set up, we'll start with 5 columns. 5. And we'll set a gutter of 7 points. And we'll click OK. So now I'm going to go back to my baseline grid. And I'm going to start that and make sure the start is relative. Start is at 0 and it's relative to the top margin. And you'll see now that filled that in totally. We haven't addressed the bottom margin, and in order to do that we're going to have to do a little math. This is going to be, or at least appear a little more overwhelming than it actually is. A lot of it has to do with the conversion of picas to points. So our document, if you remember, and if you ever need to check how large a document is, you can go File, Document Setup. You can see that it's 48 points, or sorry, 48 picas. 48 picas, 48 times 12 is 576 points. So it's either 48 pica or 576 points tall. We have a baseline of 14 points, and which is 1 pica, 2 points, and we decided that we wanted 13 rows. I kind of decided that arbitrarily, but that seemed like a good rough estimate. 11 seemed too slight. 12 gives us a weird number because we're working with a multiple of 7. So we're going to do 13 rows, and we are going to do gutters of 7 points. Because we have 13, we have one less gutter than the number of rows, so that's 12. So 12 gutters at 7 points each is 84 points. We'll have 13 rows at 35 points each. That's 455 points total. If you add those up, you get 539 points. You take 539 points, which is the amount our cells and our gutters are going to take up vertically, and we're going to subtract that from our original 576 points. That gives us 37 points. If you divide that by 7 points, which is our baseline grid, you get 5 with a remainder of 2, and so that's going to give us a top margin of 14 points, which we've already addressed, and we're going to go with 23 points for a bottom margin, so that's 3 times 7 plus this remainder of 2. Again, I didn't expect you to follow along, but I can show you in class how we kind of arrive that in more detail. Just know that there's some math. It's really just simple addition and multiplication, but you do kind of have to think as to how big of a defined cell area you want in relation to everything else, I suppose, is the big point there. So we'll come up and we'll plug that in, margins and columns. All this is going to stay the same. Right now I'm too lazy to convert 23 points to picas, so I'm just going to type 0p23. It's going to be 1 pica, 11 points. We're going to click OK. You can see it took effect over here. I forgot to select both pages in the spread, so I'll go up and change that. 1p11. There we go. Now you can see everything falls in there very, very nicely. If we go in and look, there we are. The next thing we need to do is we need to actually create the, so if I was to turn these off, basically this row structure. So what we're going to do there is we're going to go create guides. And first I'll make sure that both pages in my document view are selected. Create guides. The number of rows is going to be 13. The gutter is going to be 0 picas, 7 points. And we're going to leave columns off because we're going to use the margins as our column system. And we're going to fit the guides to the margins. That means it won't start relative to the top of the page. You can see if you didn't do that, it adds them in a off-kilter way. So we're going to click OK. And now, when I turn off my baseline grid, or on, oscillated on and off, you can see that those two reconcile very perfectly. Again, not really that necessary, depending on what you're doing. Sometimes it can be handy, other times maybe it's more trouble than it's worth, as it may be in this case. But that's how you get those things to all sync up. A little bit of basic math, or not so basic math, depending on how you're looking at it. And then making sure that your page size, your row size, your column size, and your baseline grid all are working on the same lowest common denominator.